Welcome, welcome, welcome to our ESU Happy Hour Ulysses at 100 celebration with Bill Kennedy. I'm, as always, Joshua Kepa-Gonzalez, Director of Branch Services at the English Speaking Union, and today's Happy Hour is sponsored by our Cleveland branch. As ideas for these lectures come from you, our members and viewers, please share any ideas or topics for an upcoming speaker or talk using the survey that will appear at the end of our program tonight. Before we get into that program, I wanted to make a couple of technical announcements. There will be a question and answer session at the end of this presentation. To submit your questions, please use the dedicated Q&A and chat modules that are at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit them during any point of the presentation, but they will be answered in the order received during the dedicated Q&A section. I also want to take a moment to recognize the branches with the most registered members for today's happy hour. They are the Cleveland, Central Florida, and Greenwich branches. Now, to really start us off today, I'd like to welcome Cleveland branch board member Paul Rampey. Paul?
Thank you, Josh. Greetings, everyone. The Cleveland branch is very happy to participate in this happy hour. Our presenter, Bill Kennedy, is well-versed in Ulysses. He estimates to me that he read the book about 100 times, 100 times. In the book itself, James Joyce describes the evolution of the English language from about the year 1000 to just after World War II when he published Ulysses. That's a lot of evolution in the language. Some of the language is serious, some parody, some highbrow, some lowbrow, and that diversity helped to develop subsequent language for radio and television and movies. Today, our language is diversifying again to include communicating with artificial intelligence in the form of supercomputers and humanoid robots and avatars in virtual reality. Recently, the Cleveland branch had a presentation about communicating in virtual reality. Our presenter, Bill Kennedy, is very humble, but don't let that fool you. He's knowledgeable and thorough. Bill has a master's in history from Cleveland State University. He's an adjunct professor at other colleges and universities in the Cleveland area. And for many years, he has been a very patient teacher for special education in the Geauga County school system. Bill, as you know, is president of the Cleveland branch. He has been president for almost 4 years. Bill is deeply involved in the Shakespeare competition. Under Bill, 2 of our winners made it to the top 10 nationally. Maria Schreiner won the national competition in 2020. Her prize was a summer session at the British American Drama Academy in London. She is a young superstar, and she has returned to the Academy on her own and is there now. Last year, our local winner, Marilyn McKinney, placed among the top 10. She is very Irish, and currently she is in Dublin, Ireland, enrolled at Trinity College. Bill himself is also a Shakespearean actor. He performed recently in our citywide Shakespeare Festival. But he's not one to rest on his laurels. This summer, Bill wrapped up his performance in a movie being produced by Netflix. Also in the world of performance, Bill has hosted weekly radio programs for about 30 years, mostly featuring Irish music. Bill not only presents Irish musicians, but he himself can regale an audience with his ukulele. Being an Irishman, each year he helps to organize an Irish festival called Bloomsday, which celebrates Ulysses. Last but not least, all these years, he has had the encouragement of his lovely wife, Ellen. So with that, may I present to you the very accomplished and very interesting Bill Kennedy.
Thank you, Paul. You're very kind. Thank you again for those kind words. And welcome to everyone. Let me first of all begin by thanking my board, Paul Rampey, Bob Cutler, the great Carol Engler, without which we could do nothing, and Ed Harvey, who is our treasurer, who I could not live without as a board president. To begin, we should acknowledge that it's Groundhog Day. Unfortunately, we can look forward to 6 more weeks of winter, and Cleveland, the Cleveland area, along with much of the United States, is bracing for a severe storm this evening and tomorrow, expecting a lot of snow and rain and ice. Today is also in the Irish calendar St. Bridget's Day, La Fé la Bridge in Irish. And it is also the beginning in the Old Irish calendar of Imbolc, which is the spring season. So according to the Old Irish calendar, we're beginning spring. It's a little cold and nasty out for that, but and so let me begin by raising a glass of Guinness in toast to Imbolc, to spring. Hopefully, one of these months we'll get to spring. To James Joyce, who would be celebrating his 140th birthday on this date, and to Ulysses, a book that has given hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, many, many years of pleasure and enjoyment since its publication 100 years ago today. Sláinte. I'm going to begin a short slideshow. My talk will be in 2 parts. The first part will be about the history of the publication of Ulysses, and the second part will be more about the book itself and some maybe some helpful ways to approach reading the book. Thanks to all of you who participated in the survey that we asked of you. I had a feeling that you were all readers, and I also had the suspicion that many of you have attempted to read Ulysses in the past, and that, like many, failed on the first attempt. Some of you have tried again. Some of you have not picked it up in some years. For some of you, it's on your bucket list, and I encourage you to get that bucket out and get that book out and read it. And so the second part will be about the book itself, the text, and I will try to leave as much time as I can for questions and answers if you have specific questions about the text or any other aspect of my presentation. So with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen. If I can, just a minute. And you might wonder why I have a picture of our beloved past chairman, Dr. Paul Beresford Hill, just to mention that he himself was born in Ireland, which some of you may not have known, as was our founder, Sir John Evelyn Wrench. He was born in County Fermanagh in 1882. So he also would be celebrating his 140th birthday this year, but not till the fall in October. The connection with Sir Evelyn Wrench goes a little bit deeper than that, with Ulysses in particular. As I said, he was born in County Fermanagh. His father was a counselor for the Irish Land Commission, and spent most of his working life in Ireland. Sir Evelyn Wrench grew up just outside of Dublin, in County Dublin, and also accompanied his father on many trips to the west of Ireland, in Galway and Connemara and other places. Sir Evelyn's father was present just outside of Dublin during the Easter Rising of 1916. He was judging a cattle show at the time that the rebels were occupying the post office in the center of Dublin. His mother, though, was a Bellingham. She was Charlotte Bellingham. The Bellinghams were from County Louth, a bit farther south than where Sir Evelyn was born. And the fifth baronet of Bellingham, a gentleman by the name of Edward Henry Charles Patrick Bellingham, married for the second time in 1904, the year that Ulysses takes place in, fictionally. And in 1904, he married a woman by the name of Charlotte Payne, who became Mrs. Bellingham. And for those of you who have read Ulysses often may recognize that name. Mrs. Bellingham shows up in the Nighttown episode of Ulysses as one of the three society matrons who accuse Leopold Bloom and then later adore Leopold Bloom during his trial. This is, as you might recognize, Sir Winston Churchill as a young man, which you might not know is though that Sir Winston Churchill was on the list of the first subscribers to the purchase of Ulysses from Shakespeare and Company. Those records of Sylvia Beach are in the Sylvia Beach archives in Princeton University in their library, and he's one of the early subscribers for a copy of Ulysses. I haven't gone and done any more research into any comments he may have made about Ulysses, or whether he actually read it or not, or just wanted a copy for governmental reasons. I don't know why. But I'd like to think that he read and enjoyed it many times. So James Joyce, born in 1882 to John Joyce and May Murray, his mother. He had a fairly large number of siblings. He was actually the second child. He had an older brother who died in childbirth. So, but he was the eldest son. He had another son named Stanislaus and sisters. Grew up in a fairly well-to-do family in the Dublin area. His father, originally from Cork, had inherited a number of properties in Cork and a good deal of money, which he, through a variety of bad investments, drinking, gambling, variety of things, ended up gradually losing that property, selling it off in bits and pieces to support his growing family. I think it's estimated that the Joyce family moved about 11 times in Joyce's life, in and around Dublin. He originally attended, that's Joyce in 1904. He originally, and Nora Barnacle, his future wife, who I will talk about in a second. Joyce originally attended Clongowes College and then Belvedere College, and eventually enrolled at the University College Dublin, where he matriculated and moved on. Here's a photo of James Joyce as a child at Clongowes, and here he is at the University College Dublin. You can see he's not wearing glasses. It's a question that a lot of people bring up about Ulysses. Does Stephen have glasses? Did Stephen break his glasses? What's up with Stephen's glasses? Well, it's one of the mysteries of the book that there's a good deal of debate about. I can tell you how I come down on that. I don't think he was wearing glasses, Stephen Dedalus in Ulysses, or had glasses. Because at the time in 1904, as we saw, James Joyce himself was not wearing glasses, and Joyce was pretty meticulous about trying to recreate life in Dublin in that year of 1904. June 16th, 1904 was the date on which James Joyce and Nora Barnacle had their first date. Joyce had seen Nora Barnacle walking on the streets of Dublin and had chatted her up a bit, asked for a rendezvous to see if they could go out together. She made a date and then failed to appear. So Joyce wrote a letter to her asking if she would give him another chance. And they did indeed meet on June 16th, 1904. Nothing about that meeting is in the book, Ulysses. There's nothing about Nora or a girlfriend for Stephen Dedalus in Ulysses. But Joyce commemorated that date because it was a special day for him, the day that he met his future partner for a number of years. They were not married when they first left Ireland, and they were not married when their children were born. It wasn't until much later that Joyce and Nora Barnacle went through a marriage ceremony to legitimize their children, Lucia and Giorgio, and allow them to get passports and the like as they got older. So it was not something, it was something Joyce was very proud of, that they were not conventional, that they did not need a piece of paper in order to live a happy life. But he eventually bowed to his wife's wishes and the authorities and did finalize their relationship with a marriage ceremony in England. I should point out again, what the Irish have done for the English language. I think a list of great writers in English will include dozens, if not more, Irish writers, Joyce being one of them. But Joyce, being born in Ireland, this was Ireland before Ireland became independent of Britain. So Joyce was born a British citizen. He was a citizen of the United Kingdom, as was Sir Evelyn Wrench. They were Irish by birth. They were born on the island, but they were British citizens. And Joyce himself carried a British passport throughout his life. He was offered an Irish passport and declined, preferring to keep his British passport and his identity as a British writer. This is Harriet Shaw Weaver, who was one of the many women who supported Joyce in his endeavors to become a great writer. She was and had inherited some money and was from a fairly well-to-do family, interested in the arts and literature, and had become aware of James Joyce through the publication of Dubliners, his first collection of short stories. She got involved with a magazine called The Egoist, and she and the rest of the staff of The Egoist published James Joyce's first novel, so-called, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, in a number of installations of The Egoist. I don't know if you can read the contents, but you'll see that the Portrait of the Artist is listed there in the final installment in this issue of The Egoist, published by Harriet Shaw Weaver. Now, Harriet Shaw Weaver also anonymously gave Joyce a great deal of money over the years, tried to keep it secret at first, would send him anonymous bank drafts for various sums of money. It's estimated that in today's dollars, she supported the Joyce family with over $1 million over the course of their relationship, which allowed Joyce to continue writing, allowed Joyce to pay for the many eye operations and health problems that he had. I don't remember exactly how many operations he underwent, but he underwent operations for glaucoma, for cataracts, he had iridectomies, he had his pupils recreated. And this was all in the time before general anesthesia. So he went under the knife for his eyes numerous times with just a little bath of cocaine to numb the surface of the eyeball. And the terror of being awake and aware of the knife coming at you when that's happening, I can relate to having had modern cataract surgery and also surgery to repair a torn retina. So I've undergone some eye issues myself, and I'm actually blind in my right eye. Joyce was blind in his left eye. That's neither here nor there. The Literary Review was a Chicago publication founded by Margaret Anderson on the right of the screen, and that later joined by her partner, Jane Heap, who is on the left of the screen. They started their magazine, The Little Review, in Chicago. It was part of a movement of anarchist publications in the early part of the 20th century. There were a number of people who were protesting the First World War, conscientious objectors, anarchists in general, who did not like the idea of the government telling people what they had to do and forcing people to join an army and go to war. But they also were very fond of literature and published a number of poets, published some other writers in the early days of the magazine. Ezra Pound, who I think I've already shown a photo of, oh, there he is. Ezra Pound worked with the Egoist Press in Britain, along with Harriet Shaw Weaver, and became the foreign editor for the Little Review in 1917. And he is the one that brought James Joyce's work to the attention of Margaret Anderson, who published Ulysses in a number of installments. I think they ended up publishing 15 installments of Ulysses, beginning with this one. This was the first issue in March of 1915 and ending because of the ban that was enacted. They were prosecuted for obscenity for one of the episodes of Ulysses that dealt with masturbation. And I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. So this was the last issue in which episodes of Ulysses appeared in the Little Review. The Little Review is also available online in archive form, and you can go to the archives and read the copies of the Little Review that contained Ulysses, and you'd be surprised, there are some differences. One thing, for example, Ezra Pound did a little censorship of his own, trying to tone down some of the language that Joyce used in his manuscript. And before it was published in the Little Review, he did some redacting of his own. So even though Pound actually tried to tone it down a little bit, there was still enough to offend the sensibilities of the New York Society for the Prevention of Vice, who prosecuted. This is John Quinn, the lawyer who defended Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap and the Little Review magazine. John Quinn famously was responsible for the Armory show in New York City. He was a collector of modern art and a bit avant-garde himself, also a great collector of books and manuscripts. And he actually acquired the manuscript of Ulysses from Joyce in order to support Joyce by paying him for it. but he got that manuscript, which is now in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, purchased later from the John Quinn auction of his books when he fell ill and had to sell off his collection. John Quinn unsuccessfully defended the Little Review. It was found obscene under the Comstock Act, which prevented obscene materials from being sent through the mail. And consequently, it was banned. It was illegal to own a copy. It was illegal to sell a copy. It was illegal to produce a copy of Ulysses in the United States. And consequently, also in England, in any English-speaking world. When Joyce got the news, he was visiting this woman, Sylvia Beach. Sylvia Beach, the founder, an American founder of Shakespeare and Company, a bookstore in Paris that was primarily a lending library. Sylvia Beach came from some money in the States, moved to Paris, opened up this bookstore, and would stock it with books in English, largely for the expatriate community of Americans living in Paris who wanted things to read, wanted to read the most recent book published in the United States. Sylvia would acquire those, and you could subscribe, you could become a subscriber of her lending library and borrow those books for periods of time. Joyce was introduced to her fairly early on in his stay in Paris, and became a regular at her bookstore. It was a place to meet other writers. It was a place to meet other interesting people. It was a place for him to talk about what he was doing with intellectual and literary people. Sylvia said, well, perhaps I should publish the book for you, which Joyce jumped at. And she did agree, even though she had not been a publisher in any way, had no knowledge or of the publishing industry. They decided to publish it by subscription, which would get around some of the obscenity laws, both in England and in the United States, they thought. Sir Richard Burton had done the same thing with his 10-volume edition of the 1,000 Nights and One Night, the Arabian Nights, that he published in the 1890s by subscription, because he wanted to include all of the stories, and many of those stories in that collection were considered too bawdy, a little too off color for general publication. So the only way for it to be published at all, for those stories to be available to a reading public, it would have to be by subscription. And that was the idea that Sylvia Beach had. She would publish Ulysses by subscription and send out flyers, began soliciting subscribers to the book, and managed with a great deal of difficulty between printers in French who could not read English, making some changes to the text that really infuriated Joyce, but they managed finally to produce 2 copies on this date, February 2nd, in 1922. One copy she took and presented to James Joyce on his birthday as his birthday present. The second copy she took to her shop and put in the front window, which became a bit troublesome because everybody wanted to buy it. And she only had one copy. Joyce had his copy. She had the second copy that had been printed and completed. And it was the only copy in the store. Eventually, she had to hide it behind a counter to make sure that it wasn't stolen, because everybody wanted to buy it. And eventually, as I say, she got enough subscriptions to produce and sell close to 1,000 copies in its first print run. But 1916 was the beginning, or the sort of the onset in the middle of the First World War, which affected sales, variety of other reasons. The book did not sell particularly well, partially because it was illegal to import it into the United States, though it was probably the most smuggled book in the history of mankind. And I should say, if you want some really other details about this story, there is a book by Kevin Birmingham that came out in 1914 that called The Most Dangerous Book, The Battle for James Joyce's Ulysses, which I would recommend to you, though I think he does digress a little bit and gets into some things that are pretty much irrelevant to the story of Ulysses, but it's worth it for some of these details. There were some great stories of bootleggers who had bought 300 copies, had sent to them from Sylvia Beach to Canada, to Windsor, and the bootlegger, the smuggler, would carry one book on a ferry from Windsor, Ontario into Detroit every day for months until he brought all 300 books in the United States, worried each time that that would be the day that the customs official would stop him and confiscate it. And he managed to get across with all of the books, I have to say. This is Bennett Cerf. Some of you are old enough to remember Bennett Cerf from television in the United States, particularly from What's My Line and other shows like that. Bennett Cerf was the founder of Random House. He acquired the Modern Library publication house from Bonnie Liveright, and because he was a graduate of Columbia, or he went to Columbia. I'm not sure he actually graduated from Columbia, but he was a student at Columbia and a lover of literature, a bon vivant, very well read. He wanted to do something interesting with his life, so he became a publisher. He bought Modern Library. And then as an offshoot of Modern Library, they started a publication called Random House. This was for random texts that did not fall into the classification of classics that the Modern Library published. So Bennett Cerf decided that it was time to try to bring Ulysses to a bigger readership. And they contrived a way to bring a copy of the book from Paris into New York on a ship with a passenger and have it confiscated by the customs official there under the Tariff Act, which was different than the Comstock Act. This did not involve mail. This did not involve the US postage system. So there was a completely different law governing obscene material being brought in under the Tariff Act. And that's how Ulysses was successfully argued in court through the offices of Bennett Cerf and his company. This is the judge, Judge Woolsey, who heard the case and read the book. The judges, three-judge panel in the first trial of Ulysses in the Little Review actually never read the book, because under that law, under the Comstock Act, it was not required that the entire book be obscene. It was not required that the book even be read. So the prosecutor only had to highlight a word or a phrase that he considered to be obscene, and the judges only had to look at those words and phrases and just determine whether the book was obscene or not, which is what they had done then. In the case of the Tariff Act, the entire book had to be taken into consideration. Judge Woolsey was a scholar, a reader. He had a library of some 10,000 books, and he took the book Ulysses to his estate in the country, in his library, and read it carefully, and came to the conclusion that it was not obscene, that there was artistic literary merit, and that the vulgarity perhaps would not in any way act as an aphrodisiac or cause any kind of problems with our youth or any reader if they were able to read it. He also found it difficult to read, but managed to read it. And the announcement of the successful prosecution and successful defense of the prosecution of James Joyce's Ulysses made the cover of Time magazine. And orders flooded in. This is the first edition jacket of the Random House Random House publication. This is the cover. And I actually have one of those first editions. It's, though, completely beat up because it's an ex-library copy. And I'm not sure you can see this, but you can see how they stamped the withdrawal dates on the flyleaf of the book. It's rather beat up, but I treasure it anyway because it is one of the first copies printed by Random House in the United States. They initially thought they'd published 10,000 copies. They had 12,000 pre-orders even before they began publication. They began publication as soon as they heard the results of the trial, which was on December 7th, 1933. And eventually they ended up selling by April of that year over 34,000 copies of the book. So Ulysses became an instantaneous success in the United States, and that opened the way for it to be accepted and legal in the United Kingdom as well. This photo is probably one of the favorite photos of Ulysses enthusiasts. This, of course, is Marilyn Monroe reading her copy of Ulysses. This photo was taken in 1955 by Eve Arnold. And it's not a staged photo. Eve Arnold has said that when she picked up Marilyn for this photo shoot, they were doing a photo shoot in a playground in New York City. Marilyn brought the book with her, and Eve Arnold asked her what she was doing, and she said she takes it everywhere with her. Marilyn Monroe said she likes to read it aloud. She likes to hear how the words sound. She doesn't always understand it, but she reads it all the time. So she was an avid reader of Ulysses herself. And if Marilyn Monroe can read Ulysses, anyone can read Ulysses, I suppose, not to disparage her intelligence in any way. But just to say that Ulysses is a book for everyone. It's not for scholars. It's not for special people. It's a book meant to be read. Joyce designed it to be read for the modern reader in the modern age. This is a photo taken on the first Bloomsday, the 50th anniversary of June 16th, 1904 was June 16th, 1954. And this group of Irish writers and thinkers decided to retrace the steps of Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus in Dublin on that day. And this became the first Bloomsday. We have John Ryan, who is a critic. He's on the left of the screen. Anthony Cronin, an Irish poet. In the center is Brian O'Nolan, also known under his pen name as Flann O'Brien. The tall gentleman in glasses is Patrick Kavanagh, the Irish poet. And the figure to the right of the screen, if you can see him, is a relative of James Joyce, a cousin by the name of Tom Joyce, who went along to represent the family. The story is they did not get very far. They had intended to really retrace the book all day, and they ended up in John Ryan's pub where they got absolutely blotto and did not get very far. But this was the beginning of the celebrations of Bloomsday, which continue to this day. It's one of the largest public gatherings in cities around the world. Bloomsday is celebrated in Paris, in Rome, in Dublin every year, and in Cleveland every year. We've had the pleasure of celebrating Bloomsday. And I hope we can get back to that sometime soon. And with that, I will stop the screen share and move on. We're quickly running out of time. which I apologize for. But a lot to talk about. So, what is Ulysses? It's a book in which characters perform and practice cogitation, meditation, remuneration, oration, perseveration, masturbation, urination, defecation, any number of other nouns you can think of, one of which got Joyce in a great deal of trouble with the little review, and that was masturbation in the Gertie McDowell episode. It begins on June 16th. We find out later in the book, it begins like many books in medias res, in the middle of things. We don't know exactly where we are or what's going on. It just starts. And I think it's appropriate to read a little bit of the book on this anniversary. Stately, plump Buck Mulligan came from the stairhead, bearing a bowl of lather on which a mirror and a razor lay crossed. A yellow dressing gown, ungirdled, was sustained gently behind him by the mild morning air. He held the bowl aloft and intoned, "Introibo ad altare Dei." Halted, he peered down the dark winding stairs and called up coarsely, "Come up, Kinch, come up, you fearful Jesuit." Solemnly he came forward and mounted the round gun rest. He faced about and blessed gravely thrice the tower, the surrounding country, and the awakening mountains. Then, catching sight of Stephen Dedalus, he bent towards him and made rapid crosses in the air, gurgling in his throat and shaking his head. Stephen Dedalus, displeased and sleepy, leaned his arm on the top of the staircase and looked coldly at the shaking, gurgling face that blessed him, equine in its length, and at the light, untonsured hair, grained and hued like pale oak. So the beginning sentences. Where are we? We are in a Martello Tower in Sandy Cove, just outside of Dublin, on the coast, on Dublin Bay. The Martello Towers were built to defend Ireland against the French and had been unused and then were being rented out to people by the government. And Joyce's friend, Oliver St. John Gogarty, rented the tower in the summer of 1904, and Joyce was a temporary resident there. We find out later in the episode that they've had a falling out of sorts, and things are not happy between them. I should mention, before I go further, if you look at Dubliners, give you some idea of James Joyce's style and the beauty of Ulysses. The reason why it's read over and over again by people such as myself, because it reveals itself to you. It's a book that teaches you how to read it. People generally ask when they think about reading Ulysses, well, what should I do? What do I need? And I think the flip answer would be, well, first of all, you need to know and memorize the Bible. You need to know all of Shakespeare. You need to know all of Milton. You need to know all of Homer. You need to know all of Virgil and the Aeneid. Dante, you need to know that. You need to speak at least 6 languages pretty well: French, German, Italian, Latin, some Greek. But on the other hand, you don't need any of that. You just need to have a love of literature and a love of reading, because the book, as I say, will teach you how it wants to be read. It will reveal things to you the more you read it. That's one thing that I've found in no other book that I've ever read. Nothing else approaches that except Joyce's Ulysses. And he does something like that already in his short story, The Dead, from Dubliners. In the beginning of the story, we are introduced to Lily, the caretaker's daughter, and she's waiting for Gabriel Conroy and his wife, Greta Conroy, to arrive at Gabriel's aunt's house for their annual 12th night dinner, Christmas season. And she began speaking. As you read, you would read, "Oh, Mr. Conroy," said Lily to Gabriel when she opened the door for him. "Miss Kate and Miss Julia thought you were never coming. Good night, Mrs. Conroy." It goes on for there. And she further says later, "Miss Kate, here's Mrs. Conroy." And then later on, she says, "Is it snowing again, Mr. Conroy?" asked Lily. She had preceded him into the pantry to help him off with his overcoat. Then you get this sentence: Gabriel smiled at the 3 syllables she had given his surname and glanced at her. So Joyce tells you there that you've been reading this incorrectly, that every time you read Conroy from Lily's mouth, you should have had that epithetic vowel, just as in the Irish word for spring, imbolic. There is a vowel between consonants. So it's not Conroy, it's Conroy. Now that's something you'll remember every time you read the book in the future. And if you come upon it the next time you read it, you will see, or you will read, "Oh, Mr. Conroy," and so forth. Joyce does the same thing with Ulysses over and over again. You're introduced to different characters and different languages, and some of it is difficult, I have to say. For example, this is on page 10 of my text. Stephen is thinking about his mother who has died. Stephen has left Ireland. I should probably backtrack. If there is anything I would recommend to readers, it would be that you probably read Dubliners and read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. At the end of A Portrait of the Artist, a Young Man, Stephen is getting ready to leave Ireland and go to Paris. Just before the beginning of Ulysses, Stephen has been called back, we will find out in the text. He's been called back to Ireland because his mother was dying. He gets a telegram in Paris and returns. As Ulysses opens, she has died and he is in mourning. And he thinks about her throughout the day. And as he's thinking about her, he's remembering the circumstances in her bedroom at her death. The priest saying the prayers for the dying out of the Catholic Missal. And they were in Latin at that time. So if you don't know any Latin, you'll come across this phrase, Liliata rutilantium te canfusorum turma secumdet, jubilantium te virginum chorus excipiat. So in English, that means, may the throng of confessors, bright as lilies, surround you. May the chorus of virgins receive you into heaven. So Stephen Dedalus, AKA James Joyce, is remembering the death of his mother and the circumstances there. At the very end of that chapter, of the first chapter, again, in my book, it's on page 23, you have those lines repeated, but they're separated into 3. So you have fragments in 3 lines. You have Liliata rutilantium, terma circumdat, jubilantium te virginum. So it's not complete, it's fragmentary, and it's in 3s. Now, the first time you read Ulysses, you'll come across that, you'll struggle through it, you might have trouble with the Latin. it's much easier today. You don't need all of the dictionaries that I own. You can go to the website and type in a Latin phrase and get a translation instantaneously. But you'll read through it, you'll stumble through it. And then maybe the fourth or fifth time you're reading the book, when you have read the fourth episode, which introduces Leopold Bloom, at the end of that episode, we read, "A creak and a dark whir in the air high up, the bells of George's church, they told the hour, loud, dark iron." And then the text just says, "Hey ho, apostrophe, hey ho, apostrophe," again in 3 lines, hey ho, hey ho, hey ho, hey ho. Then the text resumes, "Quarter 2. There again, the overtone following through the air, third, poor dignum." Now, the third or fourth time you read it, you realize it's not hey ho, it's the Westminster chimes. And what you should be reading is hey ho, hey ho, hey ho, hey ho, hey ho, hey ho. So you get that. Time is very important in the book. You'll see references to the time of day throughout the text in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's a cuckoo clock. Sometimes it's a comment. Sometimes somebody's asking for the time. So maybe the 6th or 7th time when you're reading Ulysses, you come back to that first episode with Stephen Dedalus, and you come across those 3 lines of Latin, and you realize that Stephen is doing the same thing. Stephen is hearing a church bell as he's walking. Stephen is hearing the time being sounded. And in his head, he hears, "Liliata rutilantium, turma circumdet, jubilantium te virginum." So it's also quarter 2. And that's one of the things you'll see as you read the text. There are parallels between the first 3 episodes and what happens throughout the rest of the book. Begins at 8 o'clock in the morning in the Martello Tower with Stephen Dedalus, Buck Mulligan, and an Englishman named Haynes. And then the 4th episode begins our story of Leopold Bloom. If you get to the 4th episode, many people stop at the 3rd episode, sadly. But once you get to the 4th episode, you get this. You begin the story of Leopold Bloom, and it's also 8 o'clock in the morning as his story begins. The stumbling block for most people, as I said, is chapter 3, and all this requires is just a dictionary and some careful reading. You don't have to know a great deal about Joyce's reading habits. Again, they're revealed to you. So the beginning of episode 3 begins, "Ineluctable modality of the visible." At least that, if no more. Now that throws people right away. What does that mean? Well, ineluctable is another word for inescapable. Modality is sensory perception. So if you remember it all, if you ever studied Aristotle, you realize that Joyce is thinking about Aristotle's ideas. And ineluctable modality of the visible means just the inevitable, inescapable use of vision to perceive the world. And that comes through in the rest of the text. If you read along, you realize what he's doing. He closes his eyes and tries to walk. And he opens his eyes and he wonders, is the world still there when I open my eyes? So he's thinking about philosophy. He's thinking about visiting his uncle. He never does, but he imagines it. He sees people on the beach and he invents stories about them. He's thinking about his life. He's thinking about his loneliness, and he's creating. He's writing poetry. And my way of thinking is that those first 3 episodes, the book is structured in such a way that it's in 3 parts, numbered 1, 2, and 3, consisting of a number of episodes that are unnumbered, not numbered. They just, an episode ends and another episode begins. So the first 3 episodes in scholarly terms are known as the telemachia because of the Homeric references that some Joyce scholars got into. Joyce himself suggested them, but my feeling is that Joyce's idea was these were to be meant as points of to be considered, some things to think about, not in any way as an answer key. So I don't think you can make exact parallels. You can't say that Stephen Dedalus is Telemachus, Leopold Bloom is Ulysses, Molly Bloom is Penelope, and so forth. There are no direct comparisons or relations between those characters, but you can think about how they might relate to the story of Ulysses from Homer. And that's where we have here. I think at that point, rather than go on and read a bit more, I'll see what we have for questions and open it up for questions and answers now.
All right. Well, thank you, Bill, for all of that. We do have some questions that have already cropped up, so I will get straight into them. So our first question is from John Matheson, who asks, do you recommend using a reader's guide when reading Ulysses? I used Harry Blemire's New Bloomsday book and found it very helpful.
You know, I don't recommend using them. I think they're useful maybe the 3rd or 4th time through if you really want to examine some things in more detail. You can use Stuart Gilbert and Gifford's annotations and allusions in Ulysses, the New Bloomsday book, Ulysses and Us by Declan Kyberd. There are dozens, there's probably over 300 books written about Ulysses and well over 3,000 articles published about Ulysses in the journals. And I find them really more distracting than helpful. If people have to keep going back from the text to a reference and back to the text, it stops the flow of the text from actually informing you, from actually guiding you itself. And that's what I think the book does. I think the book tells you how to read it the more you read it. Unfortunately, you can't read it the second time first. You have to read it once. Then the second time you read it, as you read it, you'll see the things that were foreshadowed in the earlier episodes later in the book. You'll remember what's going to happen. Just as in the short story, The Dead, you'll know how to pronounce a name because it'll be referred to later on in the book. But the first time you come across it, it does not. Just like the bells chiming. You don't always know that the first time you read through it. You don't think, well, what is this hey-ho? And certainly the first time you read episode 1 with Stephen Dedalus, you don't think that Latin has anything to do with bell chimes. But the book eventually will give you these hints, will give you these, will reveal itself to you. And that's not to say that the reference books aren't helpful or aren't useful. I think you can get something from them, but I don't think you really need to know who the actual person was that Joyce is referring to in real life. He's taken those people from real life. He's taken himself. He's taken his friends, Oliver St. John Gogarty. He's taken all of the characters from Dubliners and put them in as characters in Ulysses. They're not the same people. Buck Mulligan is not Gogarty. Buck Mulligan is a character based on Gogarty. Is it helpful to know that there was an Oliver Gogarty and that Joyce had a relationship with him and that Buck Mulligan is based on him, I suppose it might help, but it's not essential in terms of reading the book. I hope that answers. That's my opinion anyway.
So I'm actually going to combine two questions that we have here. So very interesting history of the book. Thank you. Do you think the book became famous for the idea of being banned rather than for its literary merit? And I'm going to combine that. So that was Robin Sinclair's question with Eileen Dworkin's question of why is this book so important in literature? So please go ahead.
Well, it's important in literature to begin with that first. It's really the beginning of modernism in literature. Joyce did not invent stream of consciousness, but he really brought it to the forefront in this novel. So prior to this time, you never really got into a character's head directly. You would have an omniscient narrator telling you maybe what they were thinking, but you never really saw their thoughts or had them express their thoughts in the way that Joyce does with stream of consciousness. So it's the beginning of modernism, which later on Virginia Woolf and Faulkner and so many writers would take up and make their own. Without this book, I don't know where we would be in literature today. In terms of the first question, I think it's infamy probably did generate a lot of sales. I think once you ban something, everybody wants to do it. We learned that lesson in Prohibition. You ban alcohol, and suddenly we have a nation of alcoholics, because people who would never think to drink did it because it was illicit, because it was fun, because it was dangerous, because you could go to a speakeasy, which was a secret place, and be a hipster and get drunk. I think banning books has always created a market for books. And unfortunately, we're seeing that same ugly notion rear its head in our own country today with school boards and states and governments trying to ban books. I think, I don't know, maybe perhaps Winston Churchill wanted to read the naughty bits. Many people did. Many people bought the book hoping that they would find the lurid sections and get off on them. You have to really search in the book to find them. There are some dirty words. There are some human activities that are not necessarily done in polite society. There are some human activities like defecation and urination that are not normally written about in literature, but Joyce manages to do it in this book. And if it's not at all titillating, I don't think. I think it's a very human book, deals with human emotions and human problems. If you don't know the story, if you haven't read the book, I don't want to spoil it for you, but after the first 3 episodes of Stephen, the continuation of Portrait of the Artist, we begin a collection. We get 15 more episodes, and just like there are 15 short stories in Dubliners, I think this is Joyce showing us his creative process and giving us another themed novel, 15 short stories around life in Dublin, featuring Leopold Bloom and Molly Bloom and their relationship. Leopold Bloom is a secular Jewish man. He's also been baptized in the Protestant church, and he's been baptized in the Catholic church when he married his wife, Molly. Molly is originally from Gibraltar. They had 2 children. They currently have a daughter. They had a son who died very young in childbirth. Leopold Bloom has not gotten over that, and it's affected their marriage. So the story of Ulysses is not at all one of romance and not in any way aphrodisiacal. It's really about serious human problems and how people deal with real tragedy and how people deal with relationships around those tragedies.
So our next question is from Michael Wells, who asks, what edition do you recommend? Why is Gobbler so controversial? I have a 1922 Oxford reprint of the beach text.
Yeah, that's the thing. So recently, the 1922 Shakespeare and Company edition has been reprinted in facsimile. Perfectly good, but it has all of the mistakes that were in the original publication. One thing I didn't mention about the Random House publication of 1934 is when they got ready to print very quickly, and they used plates from a pirate publisher and not from the Shakespeare and Company plates. So it was an uncorrected text up until 1961. So for me, the best edition is the 1961 Random House edition. Now that's also available in paperback, in vintage books. This is the 1961 Random House edition. A great copy. I probably have 30 or 40 copies of Ulysses because I bring them to Bloomsday for people to read along. And I've looked at most of them. And Paul was gracious enough to mention the Netflix experience. It's not a big deal. I was just an extra in the background, but I did manage to bring a copy of Ulysses with me on the set. And if I end up in any of the film, you'll see me carrying this around with me. That's our secret. It's also been translated into numerous languages. This is a recent Italian edition of the book. And this author, Enrico Terranoni, this just came out a few years ago, and now he's published a new edition of the book because he wasn't happy with his first translation. But to answer Michael's question, the 1961 edition is the one I prefer. The Gobbler edition was designed in 1984, mostly to extend the copyright for the Joyce estate. And Gobbler himself is not a native English speaker, he's German. He used a number of his German graduate students to do his research. They traveled to the United States and looked at the Rosenbach manuscript and other things and came up with their own text. They actually restored a lot of the mistakes that had been corrected early on by Joyce because they found these mistakes in his manuscript and thought they should be back in the text, when in fact he had already corrected them. And Gobbler himself actually adds some text of his own, thinking he knew what Joyce meant to say. And I find that offensive. I also don't like the fact that in the new Italian edition, they are using the Homeric titles for the episodes. I prefer to have the book the way Joyce published it, warts and all. Here there might be some mistakes, but it's Joyce's work and not the work of somebody else like Gobbler.
So our next question is from Jeff Schnabel of the Kansas City branch, who asks, do you think Ulysses can be translated into a stage play or even a screenplay?
Interesting. It's been made into a movie famously in the 50s. And also in the 50s, there was a Broadway production of Ulysses in Nighttown that was directed by Burgess Meredith and starred Zero Mostel as Leopold Bloom. And Zero Mostel won an Obie, I guess an off-Broadway award of some kind for that production and that performance. Just some other interesting trivia. In that cast of Ulysses was also Carol O'Connor, Archie Bunker, Ann Mira of Stiller and Mira, and John Aston, who became Gomez Addams in the Addams Family later on. They were all in that production of Ulysses in Nighttown. I don't think that it lends itself necessarily to other media like film or stage. I think that that episode, the Nighttown episode in Ulysses, is itself Joyce's attempt at writing a pantomime, a tradition in England and in Ireland of the Christmas panto performances, where everyone would get a part, and sometimes you played a teapot, or sometimes you played a clock, or sometimes you played a horse. And I think the Nighttown episode reads that way. Everything is personified and becomes a character in that episode of Ulysses. So I think Joyce himself is writing a panto at that point, trying to explain or to demonstrate, I should say, his capabilities as a writer. And as far as that goes, I do, before we run out of time, I did want to mention the Oxen of the Sun episode takes place in the maternity hospital. And it's written in every particular style of English literature from every period of English literature, beginning with English translations of Roman, starts with literal Roman translations of histories, moves on to medieval Latin prose, then to Anglo-Saxon alliterative prose, Middle English prose, medieval travel stories, 15th century prose of Thomas Mallory's Morte Arthur, then to Elizabethan prose chronicles, then in the style of John Bunyan, followed by the style of Samuel Pepys, then Daniel Defoe, Jonathan Swift, Addison and Steele, Lawrence Sterne, Oliver Goldsmith, Edmund Burke, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, Junius, who was an 18th century satirist, Edward Gibbon, Horace Walpole, Sheridan Le Fanu, Charles Lamb, Thomas de Quincey, Walter Savage Landor, Thomas Macaulay, Thomas Henry Huxley, Charles Dickens, Cardinal Newman, Walter Pater, John Ruskin, Thomas Carlyle, and ending the chapter in the American vernacular. And I think Joyce does that for a couple of reasons, one of which is displaying his ability as a writer to write in any style. But this is in a maternity hospital, so he's also demonstrating the gestation period of language. He's demonstrating the growth of language from its earliest conception to its modern iterations. And in that regard, when you get to the last page of that episode, in the Oxen of the Sun, it reads like this. So this is in the American vernacular. They've just come out of a bar. They leave the maternity hospital and they go off to a bar to drink before it closes. They leave the bar, and after the bar, they're heading to Nighttown, to the brothels. But Lynch, hey, sign on long o' me, Denzel Lane this way, change here for Bawdy House. We too, she said, will seek the kips where Shady Mary is. Righto, any old time. Lad abunter in culibulus suis. You coming long? Whisper, who the sooty hell's the Johnny in the black duds? Hush, sinned against the light. And even now that day is at hand when he shall come to judge the world by fire. Flap, ut implerator scripturae, strike up a ballad. Then outspoke Medical Dick to his comrade Medical Davy. Christicle, who's this accrement yellow gospeler on the Marmon Hall? Elijah is coming, washed in the blood of the Lamb. Come on, you wine fizzling, gin sizzling, booze guzzling existences. Come on, you doggone bull-necked, beetle-browned, hog-jowled, peanut-brained, weasel-eyed four-flushers, false alarms and excess baggage. Come on, you triple extract of infamy. Alexander J. Christ Dowie that's yanked to glory most half this planet from Frisco Beach to Vladivostok. The deity ain't no nickel-dime bump show. I put it to you that he's on the square and a corking fine business proposition. He's the grandest thing yet, and don't you forget it. Shout salvation in King Jesus. You'll need to rise precious early, you sinner there, if you want to fiddle the Almighty God. Flap, not half. He's got a cough mixture with a punch in it for you, my friend, in his back pocket. Just you try it on. So Joyce goes from early Roman literature and all the greats of literature to an American preacher on the streets of Dublin.
So we have a number of questions. I am going to try to get a couple more in by kind of combining some questions as well. And also there is a statement here that someone made that I wanted to share. So Donna Altieri from Denver states, I studied with William York Tyndall at Columbia in 1968, and he said that he sailed on the USS Olympus after college to Paris to get a copy of Ulysses. What a fond memory of my education that this talk brought up. So I just wanted to share that.
That's great.
And now we have
Tyndall very famously published a manual on Finnegan's Wake, a guide to Finnegan's Wake, which is widely read.
And now I am going to, so the first question, so these questions come from John Matheson and Jeff Schnabel. So do you celebrate Bloomsday? And if so, how? I'm going to combine that with Jeff's question as what is it about Leopold Bloom that created the worldwide Bloomsday celebrations? So I'll go ahead and combine those and let you go ahead and answer.
Well, I would say that what it is about Leopold Bloom is that he's the ultimate human character. He's the ultimate everyman. He's a kind, thoughtful, generous, flawed, lustful, a guy who does the best he can. He really genuinely loves his wife and tries to make her happy. He goes actually to the point of ignoring an affair she's having because he would rather she have some happiness than not. I mean, that's the measure of his devotion to his wife. He's a great guy, and everybody, if you read the book, you can't help but love Leopold Bloom. Now, he may infuriate you sometimes, but on the other hand, he's just a wonderful character. And yes, we do celebrate Bloomsday in Cleveland. We've done it for a number of years at a restaurant here in Cleveland called Nighttown, which sadly has been sold and closed during the COVID pandemic. So we're going to have to find a new place to hold our Bloomsday celebrations on June 16th. Over the years, they've taken a variety of forms. When it's on a weekend, more than once, we've read the entire book from beginning to end, all 700 pages of it. It takes a little over 30 hours. So that would be 3 10-hour days. We'd start on a Friday, and then Saturday, and then Sunday, if June 16th happened to fall on one of those days. Other times we've read just the Leopold Bloom episodes. Other times we've read just the Stephen Dedalus episodes. Other time we've allowed people just to select their favorite passages and read. Generally, the way I operate it is everyone's welcome. I have dozens of books available for people to read along with as people are reading, or to read from if they want to read. And anyone who wants to read is welcome to read. So we get a variety of readers in terms of ability and understanding, but it's all part of the fun of Bloomsday. Some years we do it in costume. In the first few years, the women in particular at least wore an interesting hat, if nothing else, more period of 1904. And I've worn a Macintosh in honor of the man in the Macintosh, sometimes a bowler hat, sometimes a straw like James Joyce. It's fun to get dressed up and play. And actually, I was in a performance at Nighttown. We did a benefit performance, a reading version of Ulysses in Nighttown from the script of that Broadway production that was very successful and a lot of fun too.
I wish I could ask all of the questions that are coming because I think there's some great ones that people are, but we are over 20 minutes past the time that we said we'd finish. But Let's see if we have enough time. Charles Lumpkins asks, what are your thoughts on Joyce's views of Irish nationalism and independence? Joyce wrote Ulysses after the Easter Rebellion of 1916, but Ulysses was set in 1904 Dublin. Was Joyce stating that in daily life, the Irish were more interested in cultural nationalism rather than political nationalism in 1904? And thank you, he adds as well.
You know, the question of Joyce and nationalism is an interesting one and a very controversial one. Some people claim that he was a nationalist, others that he was not. He certainly escaped Ireland for his art. He felt that he could not exist as a writer in Ireland. It was just too suffocating a culture. Now, that being said, and what you'll find in Ulysses, as you read it, are numerous references to opera, light opera, grand opera, pantos. So the average Dublin citizen would have been familiar with Mozart and other Italian operas, and would have known the lyrics and would have known the arias and would have sung them, maybe in public, maybe on the street. So this is also the time of the early days of the Gaelic League, the reintroduction of the Gaelic language. It's also the time of the early days of the Abbey Theatre and the work of Lady Gregory and William Butler Yeats to bring the old Irish mythology back into common experience. So I think cultural nationalism was, I think, not something Joyce himself was interested in, but I also don't think he was that interested in political nationalism. I don't think, had he stayed in Ireland, I doubt very much that he would have been a supporter necessarily of the rebels of 1916.
All right, so I am going to just throw one last question. This is the last one. Everyone, thank you for all of your questions and your comments, but there's simply, I think, too many to keep going. So Eugenia asks, why do you think Joyce ignores the women of literary history in his novels, such as Jane Austen, George Eliot, the Bronte sisters, to name a few?
That's an excellent question, it really is. And it's something that's troubled me as I've read. And it's possible, you know, that the thing about Joyce is he does not go easy on himself. So he's writing a story about a fictional James Joyce. Stephen Dedalus is the fictionalized James Joyce. He is brutal about Stephen Dedalus. Every flaw, every failing, every mistake, and this might be one of them. Stephen Dedalus himself, or Joyce at that age, may not have been interested in women's literature, may have not thought it worthy of his time, and may not. My guess is he would have read Austen and others because he read everything. But he does neglect it in this book. And I think he does so because he's being honest about who he was in 1904. He was a young man of 22 years old and not particularly woke, let's say, in terms of women's issues. And let me just say, this has been so much fun. Perhaps it's time to start a Ulysses reading group. One of the other classes I've taught is we've begun in February, and for 18 to 20 weeks, I've read a chapter a week and then discussed it with my filling in a lot of background information on the music and on the songs and on the Irish history and on the Irish language. And I would certainly be willing to continue this discussion going forward and to answer any questions you might have. If Josh can get them to me later on, I can shoot you an email if you care.
Yeah, so if you would like, if any of the questions that you've had here, you'll receive an email from me tomorrow. Go ahead and send in response your question to that email if you have any additional questions, and I'll make sure Bill gets a hold of them in your email address. and he can try to answer them if he has time. Thank you, Bill, for your generosity and spending some time with us over the allotted to answer some questions and talk about Ulysses. I had a great time. It seems everyone else did as well. So thanks again. I'm now going to introduce Karen Karpovic, our executive director at the ESU, to say a few words. Karen?
Thank you, Bill. Sign me up for that reading group. I would love to read Ulysses with you, because you obviously have a passion for it that I would love to know more about, because it's always been a challenge for me as a book. Thank you again, Paul and Bill and our Cleveland branch. And I want to thank again our happy hour committee for putting together a wonderful, wonderful program. We have extraordinary registrations, and I'm very grateful to everyone who signs up for these programs. Again, you know, the English Speaking Union is a membership organization. So if you're not a member, I do encourage you to become one, because along with this, we have some amazing other programs, which was mentioned before, our Shakespeare competition and a number of other things. So please join us. Again, our next happy hour is February 23rd at 5 o'clock. And it's going to be a little bit of a turn, maybe not so much of a turn, but it's going to be on the Victorian crime novel. So sort of some blood-curdling events and episodes. Please join us on February the 23rd. And thank you all, and have a wonderful evening.